Hey, well, good morning. Thanks for coming out for the presentation this morning on smart content. And I'm really pleased to get an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about smart content and you as content creators and storytellers. We want to be able to empower you to work smarter and not harder. A little bit about myself. My name is Michael Spaw. I was a Max user from pretty much day one, and I've used it in a variety of production settings. But now I get to work as a designer, and along with the developers, create some of the tools that hopefully are going to make your lives easier. So it's pretty exciting. But let's talk a little bit about the challenges of creating modern content. And for those people that do it or are associated with it, you know what the problem is. It's really about you're being asked to create more with less. We have less time to create more complexity, and that's a tough problem. And whether it's really huge scenes of artistically directed, fabricated content, whether it be for film, interactive, visualization products, or more and more we're starting to see real-world data come in, whether it be like LiDAR or photogrammetry. We're being asked to both manage that, build on top of it, manipulate it, and it's just a lot to work with. The eternal problem is that people want to see more complexity. They want a closer parity to the real world. And so everywhere you look, certainly if it's interactive or even pre-rendered, we need to add in that complexity to help tell these stories that we're being asked to tell. And that's a big problem. So, it's a pain point. And once we have that complexity, we have to manipulate it and manage it. And we can't do that all manually. There's just too much. But we're always being asked to make changes and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. How do we get in there? And if we have to do it all by hand, that's a lot of work. And as I suggested, it's like there's always going to be the art director, the soup, somebody that's coming in and saying, hey, look, we need to make these modifications. Or please give me design options so I can choose amongst these things. And if I have to do that in mass manually, that can be a lot of effort to go into it. So clearly we have current solutions to these challenges. And we do them every single day. But in a lot of cases, they fall short of our perfect goal of being able to enrich our worlds with a lot less effort. So we can talk about them a little bit. The king of them all is proceduralism. And things like Max or Maya or other DCCs have known for a long time that by giving content creators procedural primitives or options for modifications, they can go a long way to building in things like variation and dealing with augmentation and more complexity, through fairly simple interfaces of more spinners to control these parameters and give you a lot of options. And it reduces the amount of kind of manual intervention that you have to do. For things that are more complex, we can't do it by hand. So we fall back to things like simulation, and whether it be, fluids or rigid bodies or any of the kind of things that we can't do by hand, we can use these tools. But again, we have to know how to manipulate them, and wrangling it, takes a certain amount of expertise. And then we've got the traditional kind of non-procedural approaches to dealing with the request for complexity. So if you've got to fill a parking lot full of cars, hey, I can't do all that work, but somebody else has, let's just pay for it. And, that's great as long as they've got what you need and it's the quality that you need. You hope that it works out. And then the fact of the matter is, the one that we turn to most often is just plain brute force. At the end of the day, somebody has to do the work, and sometimes they have to do more work than they'd really like to. So let's talk about some of the areas where these solutions have a tendency to fall short. there are procedural tools to do a whole variety of jobs, but often those tools are designed in such a way that they really have very limited focus. And if you do get a tool that has, say, a wider breadth of capabilities, that still may not accomplish the job that you need. How do you extend that? If it comes packaged up, you could be out of luck, or you may have to look for another solution. And depending on what these tools are, sometimes they're complex to integrate and manage. Is it going to render on the farm? Do I have to worry about updates? Am I going to be able to use it elsewhere? All of these issues can come to something that you have to worry about managing. And then, sometimes you just need somebody to make something custom for you. If you have those capabilities, if you can afford it. And those people have a lot on their plate too. And Lord forbid you have to use these same tools time and time again for different shows, different contexts, because that's going to mean that you need to keep these people and be able to deal with the maintenance and the update and the modifications that need to be done. But really where all of these current solutions kind of fall short is they're generally just not very smart. And, smart's a word that we kind of throw around, but one of the ways that we might want to characterize what the heck is smart is that they have some kind of context awareness, that they know something about the context that they're being used in. So, this simple example has a couple things that I can think of right offhand. So you see these lights around the pool deck, and you can place those manually and be done. But when somebody comes in and says, hey, we're making the pool 3 feet wider, you have to go ahead and move them. They have no relationship to the pool itself. And what happens when they say, yeah, it's going to be rendered in the evening? Flip of a switch, can you get them all on? Do you have to worry about that kind of manipulation? When those changes come to pass, you have to do something about it. They don't know the context of the story that you're trying to tell. Same thing with like the trees, Those could be procedural trees, but do they know where they're located? Are they the East Coast and, so you got a bunch of oaks, or are they sitting out here and you've got fir trees? Do they know something about their situation? Do they know about the time of the year? Can you drop them in and expect that they're going to know something about the situation that you're placing them in? Most likely, right now, you have to do that all by hand. And then we come to another area that's of growing concern because we use a lot of tools. And if we start developing these systems that have this built-in complexity, these smarts, can we take them from place to place? If I develop them in Max, can I take them to Maya? Can I take it to Houdini or wherever I need to go? Do those smarts get lost along the way? Does the design intent that's been put into it transfer to another target? And if it doesn't, that means I've got to do the manual work on the other end if there have to be changes, or I have to go back upstream and make those changes and then bring them back down. So, smart content. Pretty simple idea. Let's talk about what we think it really means. And a year or so ago, a few of us sat down and tried to come up with a one-liner that encapsulated some of the ideas that we're talking about, because I think it's important to give it a little bit of a definition. So here it is. Portable assets that are flexible, connected, and react to changes in design data. That's an overloaded sentence, but it's really pretty easy, because at the end of the day, we know that we need to create things that are flexible and going to work for us. We would love to have them know something about the things that they're interacting with as far as their neighbors. And when you make changes, we'd like to not have to do all the work to make them still viable. So really that's kind of 4 characteristics. We can distill it down to that. And honestly, it doesn't have to be all 4 of them. We believe that it probably ought to be more than one of them. But these are kind of the constituent components. So we have parametric, which I think you all understand, and then the notion of kind of relational, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And then behavioral sounds really pretty complex, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's definitely the big brother of relational. And then, by definition, we want these things to be portable because we know that you work with multiple targets. So, parametric. Goes without saying, we use this already all the time. But in the best of all worlds, we start having assets that have built-in methods to allow you to dial in that variation. They change aspect ratio, variations in looks, you know. How they react to the environment should be as simple as dialing in some values. And what that really buys for us is when we start having components like this that have this kind of level of parametric nature, you know, it just reduces a lot of the manual interaction. I don't have to place all the items on these shelves. It kind of goes along for the ride. And when the shelf gets bigger, or moves, or whatever the deal is, I've got more of that information just happening for me. Relational. This is maybe not a word that we think about a lot, but at the end of the day, we really have expectations. And so simple things like hierarchies and linkages and constraints start to speak to that. So, you know, the pool rack, the balls are in it. If I move the rack, the ball should go along for the ride. That just goes without saying. That's my expectation. It should just happen. I shouldn't have to do a lot of work to make that a possibility. Simple things as far as like, hey, I'm placing things. Well, we know about gravity. We know that when we move the shelf, I expect everything that's on the shelf that's, you know, it's going to go along for the ride. That meets a certain level of expectations, you know, or kind of physical grounding of what's happening in our scenes. We don't want to have to do that explicitly. And it also goes through on kind of a whole different level. So I might be getting data in from other sources. You know, in this particular case, I'm getting stuff in from Fusion 360. I can set up a series of mechanical kinematic constraints through their VCS constraint system. You know, the designer has put intent into this object, the way it needs to move. It's a whole collection of objects. They need to move a very specific way relative to one another. And that's an expectation that when I get this in and I'm going to use it in a visualization scenario, I don't want to have to rebuild all of that. That takes a lot of time. And I lose, if I'm interpreting what it's supposed to do, exactly what it's supposed to do. I shouldn't have to create that. So in this case, we've got that VCS constraint system moving through into Max, and so I can just kinematically grab anything and it moves based off of those constraints. So the important part here is designing, or preserving design intent, and being able to convey and keep that kind of complexity. When we start talking about behavioral, it sounds like a lot of hand-waving. It doesn't have to be. Behavioral is really talking about expectations. You know, we live in a world where we have gravity, and we expect doors to open if you or the camera walks up to them. You know, and that information and that system, that kind of logic, can really pretty easily be done. In this case, you know, we've got a Revit scene coming in with BIM data. You know, information about that door. It knows it's a door. And so a system's in place that it can say, hey, look, if the camera comes up to that, I expect that door to open. I don't have to explicitly define that. And the really important thing is that's not a complex behavior. It can easily be crafted. But we also have far more complex types of behavior. You know, we start talking about simulation and agents and expectations. We want to do things that don't necessarily have to be keyed, so that if there are changes that are made, those expectations just carry through. You know, if I've got a bunch of characters that I need to walk through a space and somebody says, hey, look, let's put a door over there and let's put a wall here, I don't want to have to explicitly modify that. More importantly, I just want them to meet my expectations. Yep, interesting. We'll go past that. So, yeah, we want those expectations to carry through. And then we have this notion of portability. You know, if I create something in Max, Maya, or an environment, I know that I'm probably going to be taking it elsewhere. I may be taking it into a Stingray or another real-time engine, and I want that parametric control. I want those relational controls. I want them to carry over at least into the authoring environment and maybe into the runtime. Because the more times that I can take this information and use it elsewhere, it amortizes all my efforts. And also, if other people develop this content in the same way, then I've got assets that I can acquire that also are empowered to have more of these components in place. It makes my life easier. So, moving beyond static content, how do we get there? And the nice thing is we've already got some pieces in place. There's a lot of thoughts about how we can do this, but we're also acting upon this currently. So things like MCG or Bifrost, there are procedural methods that we can lay on top of static geometry. A simple example of a fire escape is like, hey, I'm going to need more stories of this because I'm putting it on this building. Or, maybe I need the ladder over here and it still needs to operate. I can layer those procedural controls on top of it relatively easily. And I also want to be able to start laying in these controls that give you that versatility and variety without having to be a programmer to do it. So that's the goal. On the relational side, there's several different ways that we can do that. I mentioned a little bit about the constraints coming in from, or information coming in from other systems. We have those kind of pieces of metadata, tags, information that can inform our systems to have them do the kind of things that we want them to do. And often it's as straightforward as grabbing that information and parameterizing it, hooking it up to a certain amount of logic. In other cases, it's using solvers that exist from other systems and having them carry through and not losing that data. Behaviors kind of work on a few different levels. Something as simple as modifying a group of objects based off of a proximity. That's really no different than opening up a door based off of the proximity of a camera or an individual or whatever. We have tools in place already in Max that begin to start adapting geometry and changing it based off of channel information, like the data channel modifier. We can do the same thing with behaviors in kind of a constructive type set of identifying what the objects are, making transforms to them, and then sending that information out based off of the conditionals. And then if you really think back to it, we have those kind of logic-based systems already. Those people that are familiar with Max know that pflow, it is a logic-based manipulation of procedural data. There's conditions and it changes it accordingly. Behaviors work that same way. When you start talking about the complexity of what behaviors can be, it really is a layering of relatively straightforward conditions. And we do that in MCG, and you can do those kind of things moving forward in Bifrost as well. So those tools are being developed. But what really gets interesting is when we start talking about behavior is how do we really capitalize on what computation really can do for us. And so work is being done on machine learning, analysis of incoming data. And so I don't explicitly have to point out, it's like, hey, there's a door there. Machine learning can go in and make those evaluations and then propose things that you might want to do with that information. It's like, hey, I think this thing is a door. Do you want to treat it as a door? Because if you do, I can open it for you. And that extends to so many different opportunities. And that sounds like science fiction, but it's right around the corner. So portability, as I mentioned, we know you use a lot of tools. That's the important thing. In a production environment, you use what is going to do the job best for you. But what your hopes are is that if you put the time and trouble into developing content, you need to make sure that it comes across as easily and losslessly as possible. And when it comes to these additional kind of constraints of layering in logic or relational information, these parametric components, you don't want that lost in that translation. And so there are ways to grab that encapsulated logic, those parameters that are necessary to drive these systems, and target them to specific development environments so that you can put that information in and it meets those expectations. So let's just give a super simple kind of illustrative example. We've got a little scene here of a terrain, and there's some city blocks up on these pedestals, and they have connections, and we got these little flyers going by and some solar cells and all that other kind of stuff. It's a good rudimentary example of how could you have every single component in a scene like this be a piece of smart content, that it could do a little bit more for you, doesn't have to be all placed by hand, that it knows something about the context and modifies itself accordingly, and possibly even has behaviors so that you don't have to explicitly define all aspects of what's going on in the scene. So if you were to start out with, say, a piece of topology for your ground, a smart asset, you would want it to know that it's a piece of terrain. How are you going to define what's the difference between ground and water? The materials, the look and feel of those forms, that should be intrinsic in that parametric object, and give you the versatility to dial it in or to explore that space without you having to layer on the various controls. You should be able to artistically move through that object and determine what it is that you want without having to define it by building it up by hand. For these little pedestal kind of city block pieces, I know that I'm going to want to lay these in, and they need to be relational to that terrain object. But naturally, this is a component that's going to have some degree of artistic direction. So I want variation. I want to see options and placement, and how they relate to the terrain should remain consistent. And if I start going in and creating connections for causeways or whatever, it's like I want those to update automatically. If I move one of these guys, I want it to refigure the path that's going. It shouldn't just be point to point. It should know that it's, hey, closest distance, I'm going to connect these guys, and when I change that, they behave accordingly. And then I've got to populate these things with a bunch of geometric structures, city blocks, whatever the deal is. But because it's coming in as something that's being art directed, I need to follow a language, a style that's been defined. But I need to have that procedural versatility, these parametric objects, so I can make those modifications. And I need to do variations on the theme because there's a lot of them, and I don't want to do them all by hand. So I need to be able to set up rules that do the definition for where these guys go and how they relate to one another. And they all have to look somewhat self-similar. I just don't want to have to define them all by hand. As we move forward, we want these objects to interact with each other, and we don't want them just as kind of one-offs, Don't want to place them just by hand. And then we've got other elements, we're going to have to do organic stuff, foliage, whatever. And as I mentioned in the earlier example, it's like, sure, create a parametric object that gives you that kind of versatility. But you can imagine that for a smart object, it may have more logic in it that's based off of the context of how it's being used. Locationally, I could know what species of trees are good options. I don't have to go out and hunt and find what's appropriate. I should be able to get that information and automatically being given options that I can choose among things that makes sense. And so then I've got all these elements, and I've got to manage them, I've got to place them, I've got to make the variations on that. But they have relational information as well. They need to drop on the pedestals automatically. That's what I've defined them to do. Oh, if I need to make more of them or smaller or whatever, can I put more of them in there? The system ought to be able to define some of those things for you. Because as we all know, we're always asked to make, directorial-based changes. We have to be able to adapt quickly to it. And when they, come in and say, hey, look, we need these other elements in these little garden areas, I want to make sure that those trees just go into those places, and I've got the option that that relational information drives the behavior of, what it is that I'm going to see. there's all kinds of other things that we want to layer on too, because we have to deal with this kind of complexity of laying out these scenes with all this additional richness, so we want things to react based off of simple to complex behaviors. A really easy example is like creating a little solar array. It may be as simple as hooking it up to a look at to define the direction over the course of the day, course of the shot, whatever that, things need to modify themselves. But it certainly could be more complex. There's a nice gradient on what you might define as something as a behavior. But at the end of it, we really just want it to match expectations. We don't want to have to do all that work manually. And then, of course, to complete that richness, we need characters and other dynamic objects moving in the scene and working in a way that matches expectation. So I want all this background information to be going on. I don't want to manually direct it. But when I am asked to change something, I need to be able to go in and tweak it out in a very specific way. Ideally, this is where behaviors start coming into play, because I don't want these guys to crash into one another. I want them to avoid both themselves and aspects of the rest of the scene. And at the same time, I want that versatility to dial the number up, down, move where they are. I just want them to behave the way that I expect them to behave without having to explicitly figure it all out myself. So that's a little bit of a taste of how a whole series of objects could have smart content components, these notion of parametric and relational and behavioral and portable aspects of them, so that at the end, you're not doing all the manual work, but you're getting the system to do the work for you. So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about, and we're working on those systems. So I appreciate your time. I wanted to get an opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and if you have any questions, I think we've got a few minutes to do that. Yeah, I think there's a mic over here. You may want to come over, or you can just ask a question, I'll repeat it. I may be lying. Maybe there's not a mic. There is a mic. It's on its way.
I have a real application for this. I am working on theater seating for domes, various sizes, 90 foot, 120 foot, 60 foot, various seating configurations, size configurations,
Sure.
How much leg room. I'm kind of doing it by hand because I didn't know about this.
Right. Right.
And I spent a lot of time.
Absolutely.
And doing iterations. That's the,
Of
like
course.
you said, iterations is what I'd like to do and make things fit. And then there's certain rules,
Yep.
Architectural rules and fire codes. I'm not expecting fire codes, but I'd like to put seating out really procedurally and dial in how much space is in between and have it offset itself. Is there something in Maya or Max already, a plug-in that does seating arrangements?
There's a simple and a complex answer to that. I'll try to give you a little bit of both. Things like MCG, the Max Creation Graph, have tools to help you with some of those things in exactly the way that you just saw that little simple example. When it comes to the more conditional kind of rule type behaviors or relationships that you're talking about in the complexity, some of that is possible, and some of those things are the things that we're wanting to address here in the near term, because we want to be able to hit exactly your target problem space, because your problem may be specific in your mind, but you can see how it can be generalized across the board of like, hey, I don't want to do this all by hand. There's some things that I could put in there logic-wise that I could make sure that those conditions are met and yet still give me those options. So simple answer is there are some ways that you could probably take or you can definitely take some of the manual work out of what you've currently got going on. And then as we're moving...
Max MP, what was that again?
The Max Creation Graph.
Max Creation Graph.
Yep.
MCG.
Yep.
Hello.
You had mentioned that Bifrost was going to be having support for some of these parametric modeling tools. I wonder if you can talk more about that.
In detail, no. But you know, I think it's very safe to say that there are a few different pathways that we're looking at right now, and how these systems can do exactly these kind of you know, solve these problems. When you look at it, both Bifrost and MCG they're procedural computation engines, you know, and they can be taken in a variety of different directions for different types of problems. And that's what we're really excited about, because we know this problem space is really rich. Hopefully that answers the question a little bit. If that's it, thank you very much for showing up.